I am recording this because writing it down stopped working. Every time I tried, the words shifted. Lines I knew I had written were suddenly unfamiliar, phrased in ways I would never use, details added that I did not remember living through. I would reread a page and feel the same unease I get when I find a report in the evidence locker with my signature on it, but no memory of filling it out. So I am speaking now. Speaking feels harder to change. My name is on the label of this recorder. It is my handwriting. I recognize the slant of the letters, the pressure where the pen dug in too hard. That should mean something. I keep telling myself that it does. I am a deputy with the Willow Creek Sheriff's Office in Arkansas. Or I was, depending on which record you look at. Willow Creek is the kind of town that exists, because it has always existed. No industry to speak of. No reason for anyone to pass through unless they missed a turn or were trying not to be found. We have one main road that curves like it's tired. A few side streets that fade into dirt, and a lot of trees that close in fast if you walk too far from the pavement. People think places like this are quiet. They aren't. They're just patient. I have worked here long enough to recognize every sound the town makes. The way the creek shifts after heavy rain. The way the grain elevator hums even when it isn't running. The dogs that bark at nothing between midnight and 3. When something doesn't fit, I notice. That is my job. That was my job. I want to be very clear about something before I go any further. I am not prone to superstition. I do not drink on duty. I do not take pills that aren't prescribed to me. I have passed every evaluation the department has ever put in front of me. I am trained to observe, to assess, to document. I know the difference between what is real and what feels real. Not real. Real. Not real. That phrase has been looping in my head for weeks now. I don't know when it started. Sometimes it feels like something I learned. Sometimes it feels like something I am trying to remember. The first time I saw him, I did not think anything of it. That's important. If you are listening to this looking for a moment where alarms went off, where my instincts screamed, you won't find it here. The first time, he blended in so completely that he barely registered as a memory at all. That is what scares me the most now. I was on patrol, late afternoon, the hour where the light turns dull and flat, and everything looks the same color of tired. I remember passing the old feed store, the one with the windows boarded up unevenly, and noticing a man standing near the edge of the lot. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, hands at his sides, looking toward the road but not at the cars. I slowed out of habit. We slow for everything in Willow Creek. Stray dogs, kids on bikes, shadows that look like someone until they don't. He looked back at me when I passed. Our eyes met. That was it. No gesture, no expression that stuck. If you asked me now to describe his face, I would struggle. Brown hair, maybe, or dark blonde. A face you could pass every day and never learn to recognize. That kind of face exists. I know that, because I have one myself. I drove on. By the time I reached the end of my shift, I had forgotten about him completely. I only remembered later, when I saw him again. That second memory is sharper, but I don't trust it. The more I focus on it, the less solid it feels, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. I remember responding to a call near the southern edge of town, a noise complaint, maybe, or a welfare check. The radio transmission crackled in a way that made the dispatcher's voice sound distant, like she was calling in from underwater. When I arrived, the property was quiet. Too quiet. In the way rural places get when the insects stop all at once. I remember stepping out of the cruiser and feeling the ground vibrate faintly under my boots, as if something heavy had just passed nearby. He was there again, standing closer this time. Close enough that I could see the lines in his jacket, the scuff on one shoe. Same man. I am certain of that. I know what you're thinking. That certainty came later, after my mind had time to rearrange things, that I am compressing events, assigning importance where none existed. I have considered that. I still consider it. But there was a moment, standing there with the radio hissing softly on my shoulder, where I felt a strange, hollow recognition. Not familiarity, not surprise, something in between. As if I had already acknowledged him once and failed to finish the thought. He looked at me the way someone looks when they are waiting for you to say something you don't know you're supposed to say. I asked if he lived on the property. He said yes. His voice was calm, ordinary. Nothing about it echoed or distorted or signaled danger. That almost made it worse. I asked for his name. He gave me one. I won't repeat it here. Every time I try, it comes out different, and I don't want to introduce another inconsistency. I checked my watch. The second hand had stopped moving. I remember that clearly because I remember tapping the glass, annoyed more than concerned, thinking it would start again. It didn't. I looked back up, and the man was still watching me, his expression unchanged, as if he hadn't noticed the pause at all. We spoke for a few more minutes, or seconds. Time is slippery when I think about it now. Eventually, there was no reason to keep him there. No complaint to resolve, no law broken. I told him to have a good evening. As I walked back to the cruiser, I felt that hollow recognition again, stronger this time. Like I had just completed something I hadn't realized was unfinished. I drove away. Later that night, I found a note in my logbook describing the encounter. It was in my handwriting. The details were correct, too correct. It mentioned things I did not remember noticing. A scar near his left ear, a faint smell of damp soil on his clothes. The exact phrasing he used when he answered my questions. I do not remember writing that note. That was the first contradiction. There have been many since. I started paying attention after that. To reflections in windows. To the way people sometimes hesitated before greeting me, as if checking something I couldn't see. I began to notice how often the same figure appeared at the edge of my vision, never close enough to confront, never far enough to dismiss. Not real. Real, not real. I am aware of how this sounds. I have read the case files that start like this. I have responded to homes where someone insisted their walls were watching them, where a man claimed the radio was answering his thoughts. I know the shape of a breakdown. I know how it announces itself. This is different. There are records. There are logs and timestamps and statements from other people in town that do not line up with each other but overlap in ways that make my skin crawl. There are gaps where something should be, and annotations in the margins that I don't remember adding. Most of all, there is the certainty that the man I saw that first afternoon is not singular. That the part of me that accepted him without question recognized something my conscious mind could not articulate. I am recording this now because the feeling is getting stronger. The hollow recognition. The sense that I am standing in the middle of something that has already happened and is still happening. If this recording cuts off, it will not be because I am finished. I went back to the logbook the next morning with the intention of proving myself wrong. That was my plan. I told myself that in clear, deliberate terms as I unlocked the office and flipped on the lights. The Willow Creek Sheriff's Office smells the same every day. Old coffee. Paper that's been handled too many times. The faint metallic scent of the gun safe. Familiar smells are grounding. They remind you where you are. I needed that. The logbook was where I'd left it, on the corner of my desk, its spine cracked from years of being open to the same few pages. I remembered writing reports late into the night, pen dragging, hand cramping, trying to make routine sound official. That memory felt solid, reliable. I opened to the page with the note about the man. It was still there. Same handwriting. Same pressure. Same small tear in the paper where I'd pressed too hard. The date was correct. The time was precise, down to the minute. More precise than I usually am, if I'm being honest. I tend to round. Everyone does. I read it slowly. Then again. Then a third time. There was nothing overtly wrong with it. No wild claims. No emotional language. Just observations. Height. Clothing. Responses to standard questions. The sort of thing you could skim past without a second thought. Except I did not remember noticing half of what was written there. The scar near his ear stood out to me. I could picture it now that I read about it. A thin line, pale against skin that hadn't seen much sun. But when I tried to place the memory, it slid away, like trying to remember a dream after waking. I flipped back through earlier entries. Routine calls. Stray livestock. A domestic dispute that ended with both parties apologizing to each other and asking if I wanted pie. Normal things. The handwriting was consistent all the way through. I flipped forward. There was another entry about him. Different date. Different location. Same description. My stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with disbelief. I checked the dates again. 3 days apart. 2 separate incidents logged as unrelated. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the stains I'd memorized over the years. There's one shaped like a boot near the vent, one that looks like a map of nothing in particular above the filing cabinet. Not real. Real, not real. I told myself this was stress. Long hours. Poor sleep. Willow Creek doesn't offer much in the way of distractions. Your thoughts get loud if you don't keep them busy. Still, I pulled the corresponding incident reports. The paperwork trail was clean. Too clean. Each report referenced a call, a response, a brief interaction. No follow-up required. Signed off by me. One report included a witness statement from a woman on Pine Road. I recognized her name. She runs the small thrift store near the creek. I'd known her for years. The statement described a man standing across the street from her house for over an hour. Not moving, just watching the front door. When she finally called it in, he was gone by the time I arrived. Except according to the report, he wasn't gone. According to the report, I spoke with him. I don't remember going to Pine Road that night. I checked the mileage log for my cruiser. It showed the trip. The numbers added up. Gas usage matched. I felt the ground shift under me then, a subtle internal tilt, like missing a step in the dark. The room seemed unchanged. The hum of the lights continued. Somewhere down the hall, the radio squawked with a call that had nothing to do with me. I decided to talk to someone. Not about everything, just enough to test the edges of reality, to see if they held. I started with the dispatcher on duty that morning. She'd been working Willow Creek longer than I had. Knew my voice, my habits. If I asked her directly whether I'd been losing time, she'd worry. I didn't want that. Instead, I asked casually if she remembered the calls from Pine Road a few nights back. She didn't hesitate. Said yes. Said she remembered because the woman had called twice, nervous the second time. I asked if she remembered who responded. There was a pause then. A short one. Barely noticeable if you weren't listening for it. You did, she said finally. Her tone was neutral. Matter of fact, but there was something underneath it. A carefulness I'd never heard before. I asked if anyone else had been on shift. She checked. I could hear the click of keys over the line. No, she said. Just you. I thanked her and hung up. For the rest of the morning, I went about my duties like everything was normal. I answered calls. I filled out forms. I nodded along to a conversation about weather patterns and crop yields. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, something was loosening. Around midday, I drove out to Pine Road. I told myself I was just following up. Community relations. That's a phrase that can justify almost anything in a town like this. The road curves along the creek, trees crowding close, branches knitting overhead in places. The woman's house sits back from the road, white paint peeling, porch sagging slightly on the left side. I'd been there dozens of times over the years. She answered the door on the second knock. When she saw me, her expression flickered. Relief, maybe? Or recognition layered over something else. "You came back," she said. I told her I was just checking in. Asked if everything was all right. She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled like dust and old fabric. The thrift store scent, transported home. I noticed the windows were all covered, curtains drawn tight despite the daylight. We sat at the small kitchen table. I asked her about the night she'd called. Asked her to tell me what she remembered. She described the man again. Standing across the street. Facing the house, not moving. She said she'd watched him from the window for a long time before calling, hoping he'd leave on his own. I asked what happened when I arrived. She frowned, pressed her lips together. "You talked to him," she said slowly. "I could see you from the window." I asked her what they talked about. She shook her head. I couldn't hear. "But you looked confused." That word landed heavily. I asked her to explain. "You kept looking back at me," she said, "like you wanted me to confirm something. And he just stood there, watching you." I felt a chill then, despite the warm air in the house. I asked her if anything else stood out. She leaned forward, lowering her voice without being prompted. "There were two of him," she said. The room seemed to contract around us. I asked her what she meant. She swallowed. "I don't mean at the same time. Not exactly. When I first saw him, he was closer to the road. When I looked again, he was farther back. Same clothes, same face, but it felt different." I asked her if she'd told me that before. She nodded. "Yes." "You wrote it down?" I asked if she was sure. She looked at me then, really looked, eyes scanning my face like she was comparing it to a memory she didn't trust. "You told me it was probably just the light," she said. "You said that sometimes makes things seem doubled." I do not remember saying that. I left shortly after, citing another call. As I walked back to my cruiser, I felt that hollow recognition again, pulsing stronger now, like a signal finally locking in. On the drive back, I passed the old feed store. He was standing there again. Same spot as the first time. Same posture. Hands at his sides. Looking toward the road but not at the cars. As I slowed, my heart began to race. Not with panic but with a grim certainty. I knew, somehow, that if I pulled over, something would solidify. Something would be decided. I drove past. In the rearview mirror, I saw him turn his head to follow me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone else standing just behind him, close enough that their outlines blurred together. Then the road curved, and they were gone. Not real. Real. Not real. I did not report seeing him again. That decision felt deliberate at the time. Controlled. I told myself there was no immediate threat, no law being broken, nothing that justified escalation. In truth, I think I was afraid of what would happen if I wrote it down. Afraid the act of documenting it would make it more fixed, less flexible. Some things, once acknowledged officially, stopped being able to change. Instead, I began to watch. Willow Creek is small enough that watching does not require much effort. You learn the rhythms of people. Who leaves early? Who stays out late? Who walks when they're nervous and drives when they aren't? When something interrupts that rhythm, it stands out like a skipped beat. The man did not interrupt it. He fit into it. I started noticing him in places where he did not draw attention. Standing near the tree line behind the schoolyard after hours. sitting on a bench outside the closed hardware store, head angled just enough that you couldn't tell what he was looking at. Once, I saw him reflected in the glass of the diner window, though when I turned, the space behind me was empty. Each sighting was brief, fleeting, easy to dismiss if you weren't keeping track. I kept track. I began marking locations on a map I kept folded in my glove compartment. No labels, just small pencil dots. I told myself it was a way to prove I was imagining patterns where none existed, that the dots would scatter randomly, disproving my growing unease. They didn't. The dots formed a loose ring around the center of town. Not a perfect circle, more like a boundary, as if he were pacing something in. I started cross-referencing old calls, missing pets, reports of someone seen near a property line who vanished before deputies arrived, complaints that never went anywhere because there was nothing concrete to follow up on. Faces blurred together in my memory as I read. Dates overlapped in ways that made my head ache. One file stood out. A missing person report from 15 years ago. A man who left his house one morning and never returned. No signs of struggle. No vehicle found, just absence. The description caught my attention. Average height. Unremarkable features. Known by neighbors but not well. No enemies. No clear reason to leave. The photo attached to the report was grainy. The kind printed from a cheap camera. Colors washed out. Still, when I looked at it, that hollow recognition flared again, sharp enough to make me inhale. Same man, not identical in the way twins are identical. Identical in the way something copied imperfectly still carries the essence of the original. I checked the date of the report again. 15 years, long before I'd come to Willow Creek. Long before some of the people I'd spoken to had moved here. I closed the file and sat there for a long time, listening to the building settle around me. The walls creak when the temperature shifts. The pipes knock softly even when no water is running. I had always thought of those sounds as comforting. Proof that the place was alive in a mundane way. That day, they felt like breathing. I decided to speak to the sheriff. That choice took longer than it should have. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, trimming away anything that sounded unhinged. I focused on the inconsistencies in the reports, the gaps in memory, the witness statements that didn't align. Those were objective facts. Those were safe. The sheriff listened without interrupting. He sat behind his desk, hands folded, eyes steady. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and regarded me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "You've been working a lot," he said. I nodded. It was true enough. He suggested I take a few days off, clear my head, get some rest. I asked him if he remembered the man. He frowned, just slightly. "What man?" I described him, carefully, watching his face for any flicker of recognition. There was none. I mentioned the Pine Road incident, the feed store, the old reports. He told me he'd look into it. When I left his office, I felt lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter for having spoken, heavier because something about the conversation hadn't settled right. The sheriff's desk was unusually bare. No stacks of paperwork. No framed photos of his family, which he'd always kept there before. I returned to my desk and checked the filing cabinet. Several folders were missing. I told myself they'd been pulled for review. That was reasonable. But when I asked the clerk about them later, she gave me a confused look. "What folders?" she asked. I described them. She shook her head, said she'd never seen them. That was the day the phrase started slipping out of my mouth without permission. Not real. Real. Not real. I said it under my breath while driving, while eating. Once, while standing in line at the diner, staring at the pie case without seeing it. No one commented. Or if they did, I didn't hear them. The man began appearing closer then. Not physically closer, necessarily. Closer in relevance. I would hear someone mention a stranger asking for directions. I would arrive to find no one there, just a lingering sense that I'd missed something by seconds. One evening, I found muddy footprints leading up to the back door of my house. They stopped just short of the threshold. I stood there longer than I should have, keys in hand, listening to the quiet of my own yard. The trees rustled softly. Somewhere, a bird called, and then went silent. I did not see anyone. Inside, nothing was disturbed. No signs of forced entry. Still, I checked every room before I sat down. Habit. Training. On my kitchen table there was a piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. It was a page torn from my logbook, the same paper. The same faint blue lines, the same texture under my fingers. Written on it, in my handwriting, were 3 words. You already saw me. I stood there, staring at the page, waiting for the fear to hit me fully. It didn't. Instead, that hollow recognition spread through my chest, warm and cold at the same time, like relief edged with grief. I knew then that the sightings were not the beginning, they were reminders. That night I dreamed of Willow Creek from above, roads looping back into themselves, houses duplicated, offset just enough to notice if you looked closely. At the center, a figure stood still, casting 2 shadows in opposite directions. When I woke, the dream lingered in the way that important dreams do. Heavy, insistent. I checked the doors again before bed. Locked, secure. As I turned off the light, I caught a glimpse of movement in the darkened window. Just a shape. Just a suggestion of someone standing where the yard met the trees. For a moment, I thought there were 2 of them. Then I closed the curtain. Not real. Real. Not real. I took the days off the sheriff suggested. On paper, it was a simple thing. A few boxes checked. A note entered into the system. In practice, it felt like stepping out of a current and realizing only afterward how hard it had been pulling. The first morning I didn't put on the uniform. I woke before dawn anyway. Habit again. My body still knew the schedule even if my mind was trying to pretend nothing had changed. I lay there listening to the house, cataloging sounds the way I always do when I can't sleep. The refrigerator cycling on. The tick of the clock in the living room. Wind brushing against the siding. Everything sounded normal. That worried me more than if it hadn't. I spent that morning going through old boxes in the closet. Not because I was looking for anything in particular, because I needed something concrete to touch. Old case notes, training manuals, photos from years ago. Proof that my past had weight, that it left impressions behind. In one box I found a stack of notebooks I didn't remember keeping. The covers were worn, pages bent at the corners, as if they'd been carried around for a long time. Inside I found lists, dates, locations, names, some crossed out, some circled, and always, scattered through the margins, that same phrase. Not real. Real. Not real. I did not remember writing any of it. The handwriting there was no mistaking that. Same slant. Same tendency to crowd words together when I ran out of space. Same corrections. Scratched out and rewritten. I sat on the floor for a long time, flipping through the pages, trying to track a progression. The earliest entries were sparse. Just observations. The same man noted again and again, sometimes with days or weeks between sightings. Later entries grew denser, more frantic. Questions began to appear. Arrows linking ideas that didn't quite connect. One page was devoted entirely to a single sentence, written over and over until the paper was nearly torn through. Do not decide. I closed the notebook and put it back in the box. I wasn't ready to absorb that yet. That afternoon I drove out to the edge of town. Willow Creek doesn't have a clean boundary. It thins out. Pavement gives way to dirt. Houses become farther apart until they stop altogether. Trees take over, close enough that the road feels like a corridor. I parked near the old water tower. It hasn't been in use since before I arrived, but it still stands, rust streaking down its sides like dried tears. From there you can see most of the town if you know where to look. Roof lines peeking through branches. A ribbon of road glinting in the sun. I had the uneasy sense that I was being watched. But that feeling had become so common, it no longer spiked my pulse. It sat there, constant, like background noise. I took out the folded map from my glove compartment and spread it across the hood. The pencil dots looked different in daylight, less ominous, more abstract. I traced the ring they formed with my finger. Inside that boundary were the school, the diner, the feed store, Pine Road, my house. Outside it, nothing. I wondered what would happen if I drove past it, if I followed the road until the dots stopped mattering. The thought felt wrong, heavy, like pushing against something that pushed back. I folded the map away. On the drive back, I passed a man walking along the shoulder of the road. For a split second, my chest tightened, reflexive, but as I drew closer, I saw it wasn't him. Different build, different posture. Relief washed through me, sharp enough to leave me slightly dizzy. As I passed, the man turned and nodded. In my rearview mirror, I saw him stop walking and stand still, watching my car recede. That night, I returned to the notebooks. I forced myself to read them in order, even when my skin prickled and my thoughts tried to slide away. There was a pattern there, faint but persistent. Not in the sightings themselves, but in my reactions to them. Early on, I noted confusion. Later, concern. Eventually, resignation. At some point, the tone shifted again. Acceptance. That frightened me more than the idea of being wrong. One entry described an encounter I had no memory of at all. According to the notebook, I had seen two versions of the man at the same location, not at the same time. Sequentially. One standing near the road, one farther back, near the tree line. I had watched one fade as the other became more distinct, like a camera pulling focus. I had written that it felt like choosing without knowing I was choosing. Another entry, written later, was shorter. You can't see both. Not for long. I closed the notebook and sat in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. The house felt different at night lately. Less like shelter, more like a place where things waited. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, measured. Circling the house, I did not reach for my phone. I did not reach for my gun. I lay there, listening, heart pounding, trying to count the steps. They stopped beneath my bedroom window. Silence stretched, thickened. I told myself that if I looked, something would change, something irreversible. I did not look. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. In the morning, there were no prints in the dirt. No sign anyone had been there. Only a feeling lingering like a scent I couldn't place, that I had passed some kind of test without knowing the rules. Not real. Real. Not real. By the third day of my leave, people in town started avoiding me. Not openly. Not in a way you could call out. Conversations would trail off when I approached. Eyes would slide away too quickly. Once, I heard someone say my name in a tone usually reserved for the recently dead. I stopped by the diner, hoping for something familiar. The waitress hesitated before taking my order, then asked if I wanted the usual, though I hadn't been in for weeks. I asked her if I looked all right. She studied my face for a moment too long. "You look tired," she said. I asked if she'd seen the man. Her hand froze on the counter. She told me to finish my coffee and go home. That was the first time someone refused to answer me directly. As I left, I caught my reflection in the glass. For just a moment, it seemed slightly out of sync with me, like a delayed echo. I blinked, and it was normal again. But the feeling stayed, that I was no longer alone inside my own outline. The sheriff came to my house on the 4th day. I didn't hear his car pull up. I only noticed him when I looked out the front window and saw him standing at the end of the walkway, hat in his hands, staring at the door like he was deciding whether to knock. He stood there longer than was necessary. Long enough that the moment stretched thin. When I opened the door, he flinched. He covered it quickly, but I saw it. A small, involuntary reaction, like he hadn't expected me to be there. Or like he had expected someone else. "You all right?" he asked. I said yes. The word felt practiced, too smooth. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. He hesitated again before crossing the threshold, his foot hovering over the doorframe as if there were a line there he wasn't sure he should cross. We sat at the kitchen table. Same chairs. Same place where I'd found the note. I wondered if he saw it too, if something about the room felt off to him the way it did to me. He told me he'd been reviewing old records. I waited. He said there were gaps, files missing, dates that didn't align with payroll records, incidents logged without corresponding calls. He spoke carefully, choosing each word like it might cut him if handled wrong. I asked him if he remembered me responding to Pine Road. He shook his head. "I remember you telling me about it," he said. "I don't remember it happening." That distinction felt important. I asked if he remembered the man. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "I remember 2 descriptions," he said finally. "They're the same. But they aren't." I felt a tight, strange relief at that. Proof that this wasn't contained entirely within me. He leaned forward. "People have been asking questions," he said. "Not the kind you want." I asked what kind. He didn't answer directly. He asked me instead if I'd noticed anything unusual lately. I laughed then. A short, sharp sound that surprised both of us. He didn't laugh with me. I told him about the notebooks, about the maps, about the feeling of choosing without knowing. I did not tell him about the footsteps. I did not tell him about the reflection. Some things still felt too fragile to put into words. When I finished, he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. "This isn't the first time," he said quietly. I asked what he meant. He told me that every so often, someone in Willow Creek starts asking the wrong questions, starts noticing overlaps, repetitions, things that don't quite resolve. Sometimes it's a deputy. Sometimes it's a teacher. Once, it was a preacher who stood in front of his congregation and stopped mid-sermon, staring at the back wall like someone was standing there. "Those people don't leave town," the sheriff said. "They just stop." I asked him what happened to them. He said most of them were still around. Technically. I asked him if he was afraid. He didn't answer that either. Instead, he told me I needed to stop looking for the man. Stop tracking him. Stop trying to fit him into a reportable shape. "He isn't doing anything wrong," the sheriff said. That sentence echoed in my head long after he left. Afterward, I sat alone at the table and stared at the place where his hat had rested. The air felt heavy, as if something unseen had leaned in close to listen. That night, I dreamed again. This time I was standing in the middle of Willow Creek at dusk. The town was empty. No cars, no lights, just buildings waiting. The man stood across from me in the street. Then another stepped out from behind him. Same face, same posture. One of them looked at me. The other looked past me. When I woke, my heart was racing, and my mouth tasted like copper. The notebooks were gone. The box in the closet was empty. Dust disturbed where it had been moved recently. No sign of forced entry. No explanation. I felt hollow then, not panicked. Stripped, like a safety net I hadn't known I was relying on had been cut away. Later that day, I found one of the notebooks sitting on the passenger seat of my cruiser. I hadn't driven anywhere. The final page was turned open. It contained a single sentence, written in a hand that was almost mine. "You noticed too much." I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the windows reflect the darkness back at me. At some point, I realized the reflection was wrong. The angles didn't match. The room behind me appeared slightly altered. Furniture shifted just enough to be unsettling. I turned slowly. Nothing was there. When I looked back at the window, I saw him standing behind my reflection. Then I saw another, just a little to the side. Not real. Real. Not real. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the window was empty. But the sense of being observed did not leave. I returned to work without being asked. There was no official notice ending my leave. No call. No message. I put the uniform on anyway, the fabric stiff where it had hung untouched for days, and drove into town as if routine alone might force things back into alignment. The building was unlocked when I arrived. That should have been the first warning. The lights were on. The radio was active. Low chatter bleeding from the dispatch desk. Paperwork sat in neat stacks, arranged with a care I didn't recognize. For a moment, standing in the doorway, I had the disorienting sense of walking into a place that had been staged to look like itself. The clerk glanced up when she saw me. She smiled. It was too quick. "Morning," she said. I waited for her to ask why I was there. She didn't. I checked the roster board. My name was listed. Full shift. No annotation. No mention of leave. It was as if the days I'd spent spiraling in my house had been quietly erased. I asked the dispatcher if anything had come in overnight. She rattled off a few minor calls. Stray dog. Broken fence. Nothing unusual. I asked her if she remembered the sheriff coming to my house. She frowned. "The sheriff's been out of town," she said. Conference. The ground tilted again, subtle but unmistakable. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I took the cruiser and went out on patrol, telling myself that being back in motion was better than standing still. That movement meant control. Willow Creek felt wrong, not overtly changed, not distorted in a way you could point to and say something had happened here. But the air felt thicker, like walking through humidity that clung to the skin. People moved more slowly. Conversations lagged, words arriving a second too late. I passed the diner and saw myself inside. That thought landed fully formed before I could correct it. I saw a deputy sitting at the counter, back to the window, posture familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. For a split second, I was certain it was my reflection caught at an odd angle. Then the deputy turned his head slightly. Same profile, same hairline, same small scar along the jaw I'd gotten years ago breaking up a fight behind the high school. He was wearing my uniform. I kept driving. My hands shook on the steering wheel, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. The cruiser rolled past the diner, and when I glanced back, the window reflected only empty booths and the dull glow of overhead lights. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of glass and light and expectation. Not real. Real. Not real. The radio crackled. "Unit 3, the dispatcher said. "Can you respond to a disturbance near the old water tower?" The same place I'd stood days earlier with I acknowledged and turned the cruiser around. As I drove, the sense of pressure built, a feeling like something tightening its grip around the town. The trees seemed closer to the road than I remembered. Branches leaned inward, knitting overhead. When I arrived, there was no sign of a disturbance. No vehicles, no people. Just the tower looming against a sky that had begun to cloud over without warning. Then I saw him. He stood at the base of the tower, facing away from me. Same jacket, same stance. Familiar in a way that no longer startled me. I stepped out of the cruiser, heart hammering but mind eerily calm. "Sir," I called. He didn't turn. I took a few steps closer. The ground felt soft underfoot, as if it had been recently disturbed. My boots left impressions that lingered longer than they should have. "Sir," I said again. He turned slowly. It was him, the man from the feed store. Pine Road. The notebooks. His face was exactly as I remembered it, down to the faint scar near his ear. Behind him, farther back near the tree line, someone else stood. Same man. They did not acknowledge each other. The one closer to me met my eyes. His expression was neutral, almost gentle. The other watched from a distance, head tilted slightly, as if observing an experiment. I felt something inside me strain, like a muscle pulled too far. I asked the closer one if everything was all right. He nodded. I asked what he was doing there. "Waiting," he said. The word echoed strangely, not in the air but in my chest. I turned my head slightly, trying to keep both of them in my peripheral vision. The effort made my eyes ache. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He shrugged. "Long enough." I asked him his name. He gave it. The same name I refused to repeat. The sound of it seemed to anchor him, sharpen his edges. When I looked back at the second man, my breath caught. He was closer. Not by walking, not by movement I could track. He was simply nearer than he had been a moment before, like the space between us had folded. My head began to throb, a dull, insistent pressure behind my eyes. "You shouldn't look at both," the first man said. I asked him why. "Because then you start deciding," he said. The word settled over me with terrible weight. I looked down at the ground, breaking eye contact. The relief was immediate and nauseating, like coming up for air too fast. When I looked back up, there was only one man, the closer one. The other was gone. My radio squawked then, sharp and loud. I flinched. "Unit 3, the dispatcher said, voice strained. "Where are you? We just got a call about you." I asked what kind of call. "A deputy matching your description," she said slowly. "Seen standing in the middle of Main Street." Not responding. The man in front of me smiled, not wide, not threatening, just enough to register. "Not real," he said softly. "Real," I replied, without meaning to. The word felt like a commitment. He stepped back, just one pace, and for a moment I saw something ripple in the air behind him, like heat distortion, a suggestion of another outline trying to resolve. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the clearing was empty. No man. No second presence. Just the water tower and the trees and the sound of my own breathing. The radio crackled again, more urgently this time. "Unit 3, the dispatcher said. "Please respond." I didn't answer. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where they had been, trying to understand what choice I had just made without ever being asked. In the distance, a siren wailed. I realized with a cold certainty that it was heading toward me. They found a deputy on Main Street just after dusk. That is what the report says. I read it later, though I don't remember being given access to it. Found standing in the road near the intersection by the diner. Unresponsive. No visible injuries. No signs of intoxication. Pulse steady. Breathing normal. I was not there. I know that because I was still by the water tower when the first cruiser passed me. Lights on but siren silent. It didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge me standing at the edge of the clearing. I raised my hand once, instinctively, then let it fall. The cruiser drove on. For a moment, I wondered if I had already begun to fade. If I had become something peripheral, like the man had always been, present, but only if someone chose to notice. I followed the sound of the sirens back into town on foot. I don't remember deciding to do that. My car was still parked by the tower, keys in the ignition. It felt important to leave it there, as if moving it would collapse something fragile. The walk took longer than it should have. The road stretched in unfamiliar ways. Bends lingering, straightaways repeating. More than once, I passed the same leaning fence post, the same patch of exposed roots along the shoulder. Each time, I told myself it was coincidence. Not real. Real. Not real. By the time I reached Main Street, there were already people gathered. Not many. Willow Creek doesn't do crowds well. A few familiar faces, standing too far apart, speaking in low voices that stopped when I drew near. They did not look at me. At the center of the road, illuminated by cruiser lights, someone stood very still. He was wearing my uniform. The fit was exact. Same creases. Same scuff on the boot toe. Same badge number. Even the small tear near the cuff of the sleeve, from catching it on a nail month's back, was there. His head was tilted slightly downward, chin tucked, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. I stepped closer. No one stopped me. I moved into the light, close enough to see his face. It was mine, not a mirror image, not reversed. The same orientation, the same asymmetries. A face I had seen every morning for years, now worn by someone else with a stillness I had never managed to master. I waited for the shock, for panic, for denial. What I felt instead was recognition. Hollow, heavy, complete. The sheriff stood a few feet away, speaking quietly into his radio. I called his name. He didn't respond. I called louder. Nothing. I reached out, fingers brushing the sleeve of my double's uniform. The fabric was warm. The double lifted his head then and looked directly at me. For a moment, the world narrowed to that point of contact. His eyes were my eyes, but there was something settled in them that I lacked, an absence of question. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was my voice. I asked him where he had come from. He didn't answer that. He glanced past me, toward the edge of the crowd, toward the dark space between the buildings. "He's still watching," he said. I turned, heart pounding. At the far end of the street, half hidden in shadow, the man stood. Not me, not the double, the original. Same posture, same unremarkable presence. Waiting. I understood then, with a clarity that hurt, that this was the convergence the notebooks had warned about. The point where observation collapsed into outcome. Where one version resolved and the others lost definition. "You noticed too much," the man said, though his lips barely moved. I asked him what he wanted. "To be seen," he replied, "but not chosen." The double beside me took a slow breath. I felt it, like a mirrored action in my own chest. "There's always a version that fits," he said quietly. "A version the town can hold." I asked him what that made me. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Long enough to matter. "The excess," he said. The word did not sting the way it should have. It settled into place, clicking with everything that had come before. The gaps, the missing files, the people who stopped asking questions but never quite left. I looked around. At the sheriff, at the deputies, at the townsfolk who had known me for years. No one met my eyes. I realized then that they were already adjusting. Already rewriting their internal records to accommodate the version of me standing in the road, compliant and contained. The man at the end of the street stepped back into the shadows. He did not vanish. He receded, like a thought deliberately not followed. The double straightened, squared his shoulders, and turned toward the sheriff. He spoke my name. His voice carried authority. Familiarity. "Wait." The sheriff nodded. Something inside me loosened, then tore. I stumbled back, suddenly lightheaded. The edges of the scene blurred, outlines softening. I felt myself thinning, presence diluting with each breath. Not real. Real. Not real. I retreated down an alley, then another, moving on instinct, guided by a growing sense that if I stopped, I would disperse entirely. Sounds became muffled. Footsteps echoed without direction. I found myself back at my house without remembering the route. The door was open. Inside, the lights were off. The rooms felt smaller, compressed. I moved through them like a ghost, touching familiar surfaces that offered no resistance. On the kitchen table sat the recorder. This recorder. Beside it, a final notebook page. It read, "If you hear this, you're still here." I sat down and pressed record. I don't know how long I've been speaking. Time doesn't behave the way it used to. Sometimes I hear movement outside. Sometimes I hear my own footsteps in another room. Once, I saw the double pass by the window, heading toward his cruiser, posture relaxed, life settling comfortably around him. He did not look at the house. I think the man still comes to town. I think someone else is starting to notice. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, if you have seen someone twice and dismissed it the first time, be careful. Do not decide. Not real. Real. Not real. If you are hearing this, then I am still speaking somewhere. That thought comes and goes. Sometimes it feels solid. Sometimes it slips away the moment I try to hold it. I no longer trust continuity the way I used to. Things don't proceed in a straight line here. They overlap. They echo. They wait for attention. I have been careful not to look out the front window. That may sound strange, but it feels important. The last time I did, I saw the yard arranged differently than I remembered. The tree on the left seemed closer. The fence line bowed inward, just slightly, as if space itself were making room for something. I closed the curtain and told myself it was fatigue. Not real. Real. Not real. The recorder is warm in my hands. I don't remember how long it has been running. The counter keeps resetting. Sometimes it ticks forward. Sometimes it doesn't move at all. When I stop speaking, the silence feels crowded, like something is leaning in close, waiting for me to leave space for it. I think that is how it works. I think attention is the doorway. The town has settled again. I can feel it in the way the air presses in, steady and unbothered. Cars pass at the usual times. Lights click on and off in familiar patterns. Somewhere, a deputy is doing my job, answering calls, filling out reports, keeping things contained. I hear his cruiser sometimes, idling at the corner before turning away. He never stops here. Once, I heard voices outside. Low. Conversational. I recognize the sheriff's cadence, the way he pauses before important words. I did not hear my own name spoken, but I felt it implied, hovering in the space between sentences. I stayed quiet. When the voices moved on, I found footprints in the dirt by the steps. 2 sets. One heavier, one lighter, placed just slightly out of sync, like someone trying to match another's stride and failing by a fraction. They stopped short of the door. I have been thinking about the man. About how unremarkable he was, how easy it was to accept him without question. That feels intentional now. A design choice. Something shaped to slide past defenses built for more obvious threats. I wonder how many versions of him there are. I wonder how many versions of me tried to make sense of this before settling into something quieter. There are moments when I feel close to remembering what comes next. A sense of direction. A pull, then it fades, replaced by a dull certainty that moving forward requires something I no longer have. Choice, maybe, or permission. The phrase comes back to me in fragments now, not as a warning, but as a description. Not real. Real. Not real. I hear movement in the other room. It could be the house settling. It does that more often now. Or maybe I am only noticing it more. That distinction feels increasingly meaningless. I have avoided mirrors. Reflections lag sometimes. Or arrive too early. Once, I caught a glimpse of myself in the darkened television screen and felt the urge to apologize, though I don't know why. If you are listening to this and wondering what you would do, I don't have advice for you. I don't know what keeps a person whole once the edges start to blur. I only know that looking directly at things seems to force them into shapes that demand consequences. The town prefers what fits. I can hear footsteps again. They are closer this time, not circling, approaching. I don't feel afraid. That might be the most unsettling part. The handle on the front door hasn't turned yet, but I can feel the weight of someone on the other side of it. Waiting. Patient. As if they know I will eventually stop speaking, one way or another. If the recording ends abruptly, don't assume anything final happens. Endings are just another kind of decision. And I was never very good at deciding. Not real. Real. Not